We are. Welcome back to the HR Quick Take. I'm Brad deBeaubien, employment law partner at Shoemaker in Tampa.
And I am Sandy Zannino. I'm here in Sarasota. I'm a longtime HR professional and happy to be here.
As am I. What are we talking about today, Sandy?
Well, Brad, I would like to talk about the 7I exemption. So a part of the Fair Labor Standards Act. 7I in my industry, I work primarily in retail automotive, right? So we use 7I a lot, sometimes we just call it the commission exemption. So I'd love to talk about that because it can be confusing a little bit. And in my industry, we like to have creative pay plans.
Indeed you do. Yeah. So I think 7I is a great topic, also known as the Retail Sales Exemption. Although whether it operates as an exemption or an exclusion, that maybe is a distinction without a difference. It's not situated within the FLSA under the laundry list of exemptions that we find elsewhere. It's sort of carved out from the applicability of overtime. So let me run through real quick the basics of the retail sales exemption. So the first thing is a person has to work for a retail or service establishment, which is kind of the first hurdle. And there used to be in the regulations a laundry list of things that were considered retail sales and things that were excluded from constituting retail sales. The DOL withdrew that, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago. And so there's some question now about, well, what does the case law that opined on the applicability of whether something was or wasn't retail sales apply? That's kind of an open question. But generally speaking, to be a retail sales, it's got to be a business that sort of sells a product to the end user, right? You can't be a wholesaler. And about 75% or more of those annual dollar volume sales of goods or services is not resale, but is a retail sale within the industry. And then, the kind of technical applications for our workers as the regular rate of pay, and we can talk about what that means in a minute, needs to average more than 1.5 times the applicable minimum wage for every hour worked in a work week in which overtime hours are worked. And we'll talk about the wrinkle with that applicable minimum wage, which is given rise to some litigation and disputes. And then more than half of the employee's total earnings in a representative period have to come from commissions. And we'll talk about what is and isn't a commission. But that's kind of the groundwork, right? We got to pay them more than 1.5. The regular rate has to be at least 1.5 times the applicable minimum wage, and more than 50% of their earnings have to come from commissions. Sound right to you?
It sounds exactly right. Those three things. And I rely on my industry, right? And if let's say there's a car dealership that has a really big wholesale, what would count? And should the dealership actually do an analysis to make sure that they're at that 75% of selling directly to consumers and not wholesaling, cars parts it goes in there too.
Yeah, I think we look at the holistic, revenue stream of the business, and we do need to be mindful of, whether, as that sort of that first threshold question, are we a retail or service establishment or not? Because that is sort of the threshold issue for applicability of this exemption. So I do think it's important for businesses to keep in mind if they have a wholesale component. Okay, well, how does that factor in to whether or not this exemption would be applicable for our workers?
So I have a question actually that I've run into, right? This exemption from overtime applies to anyone who works in the retail establishment. For example, can you do any of the other exemptions or non-exemptions fit in there? For example, we have BDC, Business Development Center, right? They answer phones. Normally they would qualify for overtime. Another one, lube techs, right? Like this is a position where the work is overtime. Can you create a pay plan where it works with the 7I exemption?
I think the major issue, assuming that the minimum regular rate criteria is satisfied. The question would be, well, okay, are 50% or more of the comp, is it coming from commissions? And what constitutes commissions is an interesting question. One of the things actually I wanted to mention, you know, I'm always looking out for, you know, timely stuff. And there was a case in the last year or two. Do you know who Salt Bay is, or Salt Bay? He's a chef in Miami. He kind of does this salt thing where he sprinkles. I find it super annoying.
No, but I'm
he's like
gonna
a
look him up
celebrity
now.
chef. Yeah, and he's got a restaurant in Miami. He may have others too. Extremely high end place, and they apply a mandatory service charge to their bills of 18%, right? And it's a high-end steakhouse, so the bills are pretty high. So you got servers, a lot of whom are making like 6 figures, you know, waiting tables. But a big chunk of their earnings comes from that 18% service charge. Right now, we typically think of that as a tip, right? That's just a mandatory tip. The regulations say, look, tips are not commissions. But the issue that was litigated in this case was because it's a mandatory 18%, right? It's not a discretionary tip like you typically are given the option to leave at a restaurant. Does this 18% mandatory service charge, can it count as a commission? And if more than 50% of the earnings come from that, can these people be exempt under the retail sales exemption? And the district court, and it was affirmed by the Federal Circuit Court over Florida, has said yes. Actually, if it's a mandatory 18%. That these people are getting, right, it's tantamount to a commission. It's not a discretionary tip. And so these people, you know, he got the benefit of the exemption. They dinged him a little bit in some dicta for a little bit of tax issues. But as to the exemption, found that these servers in the restaurant, which typically you would not think would qualify because of the way they structure these, were covered. So just to say that, yes, Sandy, sometimes we can get creative with, you know, who slots in and how they're compensated. But if there's a true commission that's being earned and that's more than 50% of the wages, then, you know, there's a possibility anyway. Now, if a person's job doesn't pay great commissions, then I think that's a problem.
I think with that case, it makes me wonder if we're all not going to start seeing a mandatory tip on our
yeah, you wonder
on our restaurant bills, right? I mean,
certainly at higher end places, I think you know, that door was opened with that decision. So an interesting development. Let's talk about the applicable minimum wage and that regular rate. So part
this
of what
is the thing that sometimes makes me crazy, right? Like so what's your experience with that?
So the regulation says that the regular rate needs to be at least 1.5 times the applicable minimum wage. And the regular rate is the person's earnings over a work week divided by the number of hours that they work. And let me plant the flag here and say another issue with this. Typically, one of the benefits of having exempt workers is we don't have to keep track of their hours, right? Because they're exempt, and so they don't have to keep time records. For this exemption, you absolutely still have to keep time records because you have to be able to substantiate, the employer does, that the exemption is applicable. And so this is not one where, oh, great, this person, we're going to call them retail sales exempt, and no, you don't have to keep track of time. They absolutely must, so that you could substantiate, you know, the criteria for the exemption. So that regular rate needs to be 1.5 times the applicable minimum wage, is I think the language of the statute and the regulations. The open question is, okay, what's the applicable minimum wage? Is it the federal minimum wage, which for a number of years now has been what, $7.25 an hour?
Yep.
Or by using the word applicable, do they mean whatever your state's minimum wage is? And those run the gamut, right? We have some states, I think, that are still at or pretty close to that very low federal minimum wage of $7.25. Florida, we've just bumped up to, what are we at, 12 an hour now?
I think it's 11. It's on a step.
Yeah, I think it may have jumped to 12 in September or October 1st, but it's 11 or 12 for sure, which at the margins, right? I mean, the difference between time and a half, $7.25, and time and a half, call it $12 an hour, that's a big difference. Again, the way it's written, you might think, well, applicable probably means that there's some variability. So maybe we're talking about the state. But if you look at some other language in the statute and regulations, it does refer back to the federal minimum wage. It's sort of self-referential. I think the better argument here is it's the federal, and so we really only have to be above that time and a half, $7.25, which is, I want to say, $10.50 or something like that.
$10.88.
Okay, there you go. But of course, the more conservative.
An hour. That's my vote. Is the federal minimum wage, not that
I think it's a highly defensible argument. You know, whether the employers want to, you know, fund that fight, though, is a different question, right? So the more conservative take would be, you know, if you're close and you could bump them up to 1.5x, the applicable state minimum wage, then you don't have anything to worry about in that regard. And you see cases that sort of talk about both, and none of them have really squarely dealt with this issue, at least none that I've seen, in the 11th Circuit, which is the federal court that deals with Florida cases, which is where we're located. So that's one of the many wrinkles with this exemption, and one that, unsatisfyingly, isn't super clear. You'd think the DOL knows, hey, we're really depending on some clarity here, but like so many issues in the law, we have to kind of work with what we've got.
Brad, I feel like we could talk about this one for many, many more minutes. However, we're on a time crunch, as we always are, because in what we do, there's always employers who need us, right?
Indeed.
But there's one more thing I'd like to, unless you have something.
Go for it.
There is I run into this one, right? So employee with 100% commissions, right? They're paid 100% commission. It's going to cover the 50%, at least 50%. They're paid one time a month. Well, they're paid a draw.
Yep.
During the month. Let's say they're paid twice a week or bi-weekly. And at the end of the month, there is a true up, right, where they get their commissions, the less the draw.
Yep.
Are there challenges for this? When
yes. There are, but they're overcomable. The regulations contemplate this, and there's a series of regulations that talk about how you do the math, and if this exact situation, because it's not at all uncommon, right? You have sort of a fixed draw, which is probably a pretty low number, and then maybe you get a boost of your commissions once a month, once a quarter, and there is a procedure and a mechanism to go back and apply those, right, so that the employer's not up the creek because, oh well, the draw wouldn't have satisfied that, say call it the 1.5x requirement, but we can go back and apply those, and there's a couple of ways to do it depending on how the commissions are calculated and when they're paid. But yes, there is a mechanism, and it depends on sort of what the employer's system is, but there's any number of ways that you can deal with that issue. And again, that goes to kind of looking at the representative period, which is one of the criteria. What we can look at as a period as short as a month or as long as a year to sort of figure out whether the person's earning enough in commissions, but also then within any work week to retroactively apply those commissions. Again, there's a mechanism in the statute and regulations to allow that.
That representative period is interesting to me. Like thinking about it, can go from a week to a year.
Yeah, so the representative period is what we're looking at just to determine whether they're making 50% or more in commissions. And that period can be as short as a month or as long as a year to determine whether they make the minimum wage amount, the 1.5x, the applicable minimum wage. We look at that on a work week by work week basis, but there is a way to, apply commissions, which may not be paid weekly or even bi-weekly, to sort of smooth the path so that you can sort of satisfy that. But again, it depends a little bit on the way that the employer pays it and what the regulations provide for various scenarios.
So if someone is being paid monthly, a one check monthly commission, right, and the true up, it would be safest, the employer should look at the entire month to figure out, to do that math.
Again, it depends. We need to work. Every work week is its own unit for purposes of that 1.5 times the applicable minimum wage requirement. Now, if they're only paid the commissions once a month, there's a couple of different considerations, including, well, when was the commission earned, right? Are they earning regular commissions weekly, but they're only paid monthly, in which case we have to apply them that way? Or is there some other equitable method that we need to figure out for how we're going to spread these commissions out? There's no kind of one size fits all, but there is a number of ways to achieve it.
Okay. All right. It's
typical lawyer answer.
It depends. That's always the answer. It depends. Well, on that note, I think that it's time. I know I have appointments. You have appointments. We're both busy people, Brad, and I'm looking forward to our next chat.
As am I. We'll see you then.